Bonjour, Maryanna Indigenica, Jawanuikwe Induku, Kazakasquajime, Kagindunchaba, Kakabikangenda, Ogishki Manasinin Dudem. I'm introducing myself in Ojibwe language. I'm an enrolled member of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in northern Minnesota, and I am a descendant of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. And I'm happy to be here and give my perspectives on my personal connections with nature and the environment and carbon issues.
I'm Pilahuk Waido, Pinahi Piosio. My name is Michelle Montgomery. I'd first like to acknowledge and introduce myself as a forever student. I'm an enrolled member of the Halawasaponi tribe. I'm descendant from Eastern Band Cherokee. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge all the ancestors that you bring with you as well. I want to acknowledge the spirit that you bring for change and hoping that we find like-minded synergies for long-term solutions. I wear multiple hats in the places in which I navigate, but I'm most passionate about change, but collective change. Pilahuk Waido again.
And I introduced myself more fully earlier, but again, it's Jay. My name is Patrick Austin Freeland, Wind Clan in the Skokie Nation of Oklahoma. And again, honored to serve on this panel. I've been working with kind of at this intersection with Indigenous peoples, climate adaptation, and public and community education for about 2 decades now. So I'm just happy to share some good ideas with you today.
So what I would like to start us off today is to, it's just something that I do. It is such an honor to be here for the first snow, and where I'm from, that's a very sacred thing to witness the first breath of the season. And as we know, seasons mean change. And so if I could just have everyone just stand up for a moment, I just want to put us all in a good state of mind, if I may. I'm not trying to convert you into me, but I think it's really important. So if everyone could just close their eyes just for a moment, take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Just roll your shoulders back one time. Another deep breath in. And another deep breath out. Roll your shoulders one more time. Another deep breath in. And a deep breath out. Waido, please be seated. This is a very serious conversation for me. I take it very personal, as we all should. But to honor what we've just done is that the air is sacred, which means that we're all sacred. And when we come together in a place such as this, we're breathing the same air. So the issues in which we face in regards to environmental justice and justice period also means that we as collective human beings, we're experiencing the same things. Air does not have a boundary. Air does not require you to have a passport, nor does it require you to be in a particular type of socioeconomic status. It is sacred. So if the air we breathe is sacred, that means we're all sacred. And when we're sharing space, that means we're creating a ceremony. So what I want to discuss today is the reciprocity of eco-mindfulness, but most importantly, intellectual humility. We're often taught that the intellect in which we navigate is linear and static. A plus B equals to C. 1 plus 1 equals to 2. We're realizing in the state of the world that we're in right now, we're in crisis mode. And there's an instance where we need to actually recalibrate ourselves to be emotional human beings. Around the 1st or 2nd grade, we're taught that to be an emotional human being, it's an inferior trait. We fast forward, we experience a pandemic where we're all isolated. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, your access to resources are pretty much similar, but not the same. And we come out of a pandemic and we're still learning how to navigate, how to be emotional human beings. And I really want to say we missed the buck on something. For the first time in history, since I've made my journey, we've had places around the globe that had clean air. And the city of Seattle at one point had the worst air quality, right? At one point in time. And so intellectual humility is also about understanding the meanings between grace and reciprocity. What does it mean to be a graceful human being? What does it mean to call people into conversation while acknowledging we all have our own lived experiences? We have different socioeconomic statuses. We have our own political beliefs and affiliations, and many of us will have our own agendas. But when we talk about the things that we must talk about in regards to environmental justice and to maintain a stable environment for long-term longevity, we also have to think about low-hanging fruit. What's visible right in front of us that we need to have solutions for. And solutions aren't specifically from a Western science perspective, aren't specifically the solution for today that's going to be the solution for tomorrow. So intellectual humility is about how do we call people into conversations with grace and reciprocity while acknowledging that we should learn how to agree to disagree, but find like-minded synergies. And here's a story I want to share with you. Aquifers are also very urgent, and thank you so much for bringing that up earlier. New Mexico is known for a state that they've been in the red flag for aquifers drying up very soon. Some places they say 2028, some they fast forward to 2025. I recently attended a meeting to talk about climate health and policy with emergency doctors that work for Indian Health Services. In Gallup, New Mexico, they're now experiencing issues that you would experience in Phoenix. That means skin burns from sidewalks and roads from children and elders. Gallup, New Mexico also had to close their emergency room because they could not contain the appropriate temperature to service people. They also had an incident where a construction company broke a major water line and they lost hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. And the city of Gallup had to go into real life emergency mode. 72 hours, they were going to run out of water. This is a real scenario. The piece to fix the pipe would not be available until a Saturday. This happened on a Wednesday. So they had to create into emergency plan mode who would receive water and who would not. But in the end result is to keep the emergency facilities open. So when we think of the issues that we're dealing with, that many of us in this room are very, very passionate about, this is 2023, and we are already dealing with real, live situations that are impacting communities. And so when I talk about reciprocity, I'm also asking, how do we bring our whole self simultaneously to this? And the whole self is moving beyond, keep setting the goalposts in a place where it has a political capital attached to it, a particular type of number. But how do we come into this conversation and be very mindful that we're all human and that we all have a specific place in which we have to learn to navigate under the state of urgency? So for me, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that often isn't part of the conversation, but we also need to be mindful of who's not a part of the conversation. Who's included, who's not included, who's always in the conversation but take up space for other people. So how do we create more inclusive conversations? And so growing up in a very rural community, I've always been taught to have humility and grace. It's also a cultural thing for me. But one of the voices that's missed from many conversations is rural populations. We also have marginalized populations that are not part of the conversation. Prime example, when myself and several other people were fighting the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the only conversations that we received were a flyer in the mail, an email, maybe a phone call, and then they wanted to have a decision made. That is not inclusive conversations. That's also not talking about low-hanging fruit. So how do we invite each other into conversations to find like-minded synergies? And that's really actually having a little bit of grace with each other and some humility. Lots of humility. So here's an equation that I like to talk about a lot. And it's both prescriptive and descriptive. So if we put up on a board as if we were in a lecture hall and we said grace plus reciprocity, the outcome should be intellectual humility. That all of us in this room, we come with our own expertise, we come with our lived experiences, and we need to be humble that with our lived experience and expertise, we cannot stick a USB port in the neighbors beside us and download their lived experiences or the things that they're most passionate about. And it's important that we actually have these conversations, ongoing conversations. Solutions to me are often, they come across as very static. And then we have a new election. And then the next solution change. So we need to learn how to gracefully call each other with humility, intellectual humility, and have conversations that are long-term, open communications across boundaries. We should also find ways to hold deep commitment to connection to place. I hear often people, Patrick talked about land acknowledgements, and land acknowledgements is much more than just a verbal statement. It's much more than just acknowledging the indigenous peoples. It is also acknowledging the health of the place. And you do not need to be indigenous to acknowledge the health of a particular place or places in which you navigate. One other important point that are often missed in these very emotional conversations about change. We're in a very important crisis mode. And we need to create change, but it has to be collective. But how do we do our heart work? And yes, that's very emotional, but heart work is also important because we have to get to a place to where we are emotional human beings, where we actually acknowledge that all of us have a component to add to the equation. But how do we come together and do that is the big question. How do we do this? How do we do this in a fair and equitable way? Now, fair is a very big word to unpack. What's fair, right? For some people, fair is about privilege and power. For other people, fair is about constant erasure, so stop, right? But fairness and the state that we're in regards to climate change and the need for climate adaptation is we need to learn how to come together to be fair to each other. So how do we do that? How do we define that? And intellectual humility to me is also about moving beyond the static conversation. So how do we move beyond being static? How do we create more fluid conversations? How do we engage each other? And most importantly, to me, it's about how do we have multi-generational conversations? How do we do that? Many of us deal with policy. Many of us talk about policy. Many of us gather around spaces where we're doing bidirectional learning. But how do we include a multi-generational conversation? We're leaving our youth with a huge amount of responsibility. And it shouldn't just be us adult folks talking about it, right? It should be much more than that. So multi-generational to me is that when we talk about policy and we talk about things that's going to impact the human population, we also need to think about how that's going to impact our youth and our elders. So as a very traditional person, there's a gap in between that navigates that conversation. That's many of us in this room, but we also have generations of people, our youth and our elders, that also need to be inclusive. So I want to leave you with this and pass the mic on to my colleagues here, is to just remember to be gentle with yourselves, to remember that it's okay to be an emotional human being, to remember when you're in these spaces, when many of us will disagree, and we may agree that that's okay too, but we have to find like-minded synergies that are not one-sided. And synergies where people are not speaking for the masses, but synergies in which there's a multi-generational inclusive process that really builds around intellectual humility. So Pilaha Kwado for your time.
I want to start by saying I represent only myself. While I am a member of a Minnesota tribe, they have their own politics. They are their own nation, as well as all 11 tribes in Minnesota. And um, to, to speak for them is not something any one person can be doing. They speak for themselves. Uh, I bring my own personal perspective to this panel, and I'd like to just tell you about myself. I was born in Minneapolis in 1960, and I was adopted as an infant by white parents and was raised in a family with 6 adopted siblings from a variety of non-white backgrounds. I grew up at a time when birth parent records were sealed away from adoptive parents and children. So learning Indigenous traditions was not available to me as a young person. But adoptions are not the only thing that separated children from language and culture. My birth mother was put on a bus at age 5 and taken to a boarding school over 300 miles away from her home. And language and community connections and cultural practices were suppressed by these schools and lost by these children. And although I lived in the city during the school year, I had the privilege of spending summers at our family cabin in northern Minnesota. Spending time in the woods was a profound influence on me, and I chose to pursue a degree in forest resources management. To fulfill some elective credits, I took courses in American Indian Studies, and that awakened a desire to learn more. Eventually, I completed the requirements to major in both forestry and American Indian Studies. With this academic foundation, I started work as a grant writer for the Minneapolis American Indian Center. And with encouragement from one of my faculty members in Indian Studies, I transferred to a state job supporting counties as they prepared comprehensive water plans. During my career at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, I also worked as a field forester, helping landowners who were developing stewardship plans, and as a forester doing resource assessment for forestry health. In Minnesota, gosh, I don't even know what year this was, in the early 90s. No, maybe later than that. But legislation was passed requiring utility companies to make conversions to renewable sources of power. And I was interested in what Maggie said about the 100% clean energy by 2040. As a result of this legislation, high overhead transmission lines were built, crossing Minnesota from the northwest and west to the southeast to bring power from areas of wind generation. I transferred to a position to monitor the state's lands, its wildlife management areas, scientific and natural areas, parks and forests, and the state's waters, which are all public waters, wetlands, streams, and rivers that these lines were built across. A few years ago, I retired from the DNR. And at the request of an elder, I took a position to support American Indian programs for a Catholic church in South Minneapolis. And I made this transition out of natural resources and into a behind the desk job indoors. For more than a decade, I have participated in Nibi water walks, which are extended ceremonies to pray for the water, praying for healing and in gratitude for this life-giving force. In 2021, I walked the length of the Line 3 pipeline corridor across northern Minnesota, and prayed for the lands and waters and communities and individuals that were and will be affected by this pipeline. Indigenous teachings tell us, as Michelle mentioned, that our personal choices have the potential to affect our descendants for generations. The world we live in and the situations we face today have been affected by the choices of our ancestors, and thank you for acknowledging them. And today, I ask that this teaching guide us as we are called to envision a path forward for our children, for our climate, and for our future.
Ooh. So earlier I've introduced myself a few times, and I want to kind of ask you about that. Like who am I to you, right? Because if I were to be really honest introducing myself, I'm just some guy, right? But is there anything wrong with that? You know, does someone have to be credentialed for them to be worthy of your belief or understanding or knowledge? Does someone have to be in a position of authority? Sure, it's a little bit easier with a microphone, but at the same time, just as these two honored folk have really mentioned the importance of listening, right, with your heart, listening with humility, listening with respect. So that's what I kind of introduce this idea and ask you to really think about this, right? So my words are entering your ears, they're combining with your consciousness, and they merge with your ideas, right? Many you have of your own agency, your independent thought, but those ideas become action. And so there's a certain power in the word, a certain sacristy that we have to acknowledge and honor. And I intend to honor this opportunity. And so when I share my words with you, the hope is that we may act together, with this idea of a shared vision. And so I think that that's something I really want to preface. So when we think of that big word, we, like, who are we? We are concerned citizens, we're experts, we're neighbors, but we're relatives, right? I want you to think about that word, a relative, what that really means. And I'm not going to answer that. I want you to think about that for yourself. But it's imperative that we reframe our understanding of this challenge we're discussing today, and that when we're thinking about this concept of indigenous, in particular, if we think about land management and knowledges, it's not something that's this archaic idea or a romantic idea or something floral, but it's something that's been in effect, like, on this entire planet for tens of thousands of years, time immemorial. And that this this practice isn't some relic, right? It's something that arguably still exists, just in the indigenous peoples living their lives, being who they are, who we are, but recognizing that there's a certain technology to that knowledge system, right? If you think of this idea of an agroecological system, it's designed to mimic a natural system, right? Well, this could be like things like controlled burns, indigenous ways of like managing forest systems, of working with the water. But ultimately, those aren't just simple systems. They incorporate ceremony, they incorporate relationships, they incorporate generations. And so underneath it all, I really want to help you all to remember this, something you all already know. But underneath this natural system is a deep reverence for the land itself, the waters itself. And I want you to engage that, engage your emotions, as you said, engage the ceremony that you'd said. But I want you to also de-romanticize the notions of, maybe what indigenous peoples are, right? It's not a costume. It's not a this flowery magical being, right? And this noble savage, as has been described in some areas. They're human beings. But when we talk about our human relationships, our relativity, there's wisdom in those relatives that you have. There's wisdom in yourself, your own ancestors, our shared ancestry, right? Because you go back far enough and we are all related. You go back even further, we're related with the animals and with the plants, the waters, right? There's this old saying about, we share like 98, point something percent of our DNA with chimpanzees, but we share 50% of our DNA with a banana, right? So we're really, really related if you unpack it deep enough. So when we think about this connection to being peoples of a place, of being dynamic and not static, that connection is a certain spirituality, right? And that spirituality is not necessarily a dogmatic principle. It's this idea of awareness of oneself within a greater system. And in Muskogee way, we have like a really, a lot of times do things in fours, but like to first acknowledge the water. They call it our first medicine, Wiwa. So you do that, like as Michelle kind of guided us through, you think about the snow, the water that you drink, all these sorts of things that are necessary for life. Think of the air, the ololi, right? And sometimes you do that, you'll hear the wind pick up, and you think of it again as a relative, this living thing, the land, ikina, right? And then of course fire, soka, like all these things, all these elements make up our living systems, our breath, right? Our respiration. So finding that sense of sacristy isn't always easy in a again, more modernized, system, but it's there. It's underneath everybody as a human being, right? So I want you to reconnect to that. So when we think about this big challenge of climate change, of urbanization, of all these like social ills, these wicked problems, and the predicament we face isn't necessarily a lack of technology, right? There's many technologies that we can employ, but our collective problem is one of consumption, of taking more than we need, right? And more than just that, and the reflection of these choices that we make in our overconsumption is that, as individuals and as a society, sometimes we aren't in choice or of what we're actually able to consume, right? I mean, there's probably some farmers in this space and producers, and good on you. But most people, if you buy food, you're going to a restaurant, a grocery store. You're not actually producing your own food. You're not gathering your own food. If you think about the clothes that we're all wearing, very few of us probably made our own clothes or gathered the fiber to create those sorts of things. So we have a certain challenge in our agency to actually affect and make choices, right? So we have to be very aware of the systems that underlie all of these. And so with our focus then, it's not to get lost in that mire of, or feeling like it's hopeless or that we don't have any choice, because we do. But our focus has to shift from seeking simple technological processes to fostering a more profound understanding of our relationship with the earth and with each other and with the implications of our consumption. And so the challenge before us is not just to consume less, but to ensure that every person here has the opportunity and access to objective information, inclusive and respectful traditions that we have preserved these lands for millennia. And what I mean by that is that we have so many different ideas. It can lead to, a schizophrenic worldview at times, right? But we need to find, as Dr. Montgomery mentioned earlier, this shared vision, this shared knowledge, this mutual understanding of not only the challenge that lies before us, but the solutions to address it. And by working together, it'll bring light to this darkness. And none of that sounds kind of, again, also kind of floral, but it is. It's expanding our collective consciousness for this matter. And that by de-romanticizing our ideals or really understanding the objective truths of how some of these systems may operate, we can come to a better understanding and move forward. So we're thinking about our bigger picture, this urgent quest to mitigate the effects of climate change. Carbon sequestration, has this sense of being something hopeful, right? This beacon. And there's a lot of ways to do that. There's afforestation, planting trees where there's historically been trees. That also like can revitalize ecosystems. So you have this net benefit for your water. The same thing of like implementing biochar, right? Traditional burning, a lot of times that were stewarded by indigenous peoples. Like if you think about the histories of these places, there used to be forests, right? And then a lot of the history, they said, look at these pristine forests, how tall these trees stand. Well, that wasn't an accident. There were people that were living with those forest systems that were doing regular burns, right? And a lot of times a lot of the big challenges we have, especially in the West, is because indigenous peoples aren't able to express their relationship and their responsibilities with those lands. Also, there's some other interesting technologies. I'm sure some experts in this room about enhanced weathering. So integrating with agricultural producers. Looking at the city of Minneapolis, a lot of buildings are going up, right? So there's a lot of waste, concrete waste rocks and things that you can use. And really, again, the technique is to reincorporate carbon into the earth in a non-reactive form. And if you can leverage waste materials in a circular economy that not only sequesters carbon, but also revitalizes land without contributing to further waste generation. And these practices represent that symbiotic relationship between human ingenuity and the Earth's natural carbon cycle and can offer a pathway to a more sustainable future. So here's my position. I want to be very clear with this, is that reducing fossil fuels with renewable energy is the best path forward to reducing carbon emissions. Let's say that one more time. Replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy is the best path forward. So when we promote carbon capture solutions that might be unproven or that augment pipelines and adversely impact the environment, that's not the best path forward. There might be a compromise. There might be a better way forward. And we promote technologies that concern Native American tribes and rural communities in prairie and wetland ecosystems and other relatives without fully understanding the implications and impacts of these peoples may not be the best path forward. And thinking about what's going to contribute best to rural prosperity, right? It's going to be healthy communities. It's going to be generational impacts that are going to be, something that isn't going to harm them in chemical ways or in economic ways. And so I just want to kind of close there. And again, this idea in Muskogee, just to think about this, we think of this word humility, and we call it yaskata, which, I was always kind of like, we have this principle about being humble and this word humility. I never was quite comfortable with that. And then one day I asked an elder, her name was Norma Marshall, about like, well, what's the difference between humility and humiliation? And so what she told me was, well, maybe humility in English isn't necessarily the right word, but yaskata, which is a Muskogee word, basically says that I'm no better than any of you, but I'm also no worse. And all of us can kind of see that eye to eye. We all have different titles, we have different roles, we have different stages in our lives, but none are better or worse than any other. And so there's a responsibility that comes with that, in the Muskogee way. And that responsibility is that you have to humble yourself. If you're trying to all of a sudden think you are an expert or you know more than someone else, well, you might know different things, but you're not better than them. So you have to come to agreement. But at the same time, if someone else is also trying to put you in a place, make you stay in your lane, push you down, you have that responsibility to fight back, right? So I appreciate everyone's time. And just again, I hope that you think with your mind, with your heart about what we're doing here today. Oh.